7 men, 1 woman, and a barn full of people watching her fail. That's how Evelyn Mercer's story almost ended. Standing alone in the middle of Black Hollow's matchmaking gathering while every man in the room turned his back and walked away. 7 of them, one after another, like she was a horse with a bad leg nobody wanted to bid on. But then the doors blew open, and everything changed. If you want to know how the woman nobody chose ended up owning a mountain, stay with me until the end. Hit like, drop a comment with the city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The barn had been decorated with pine boughs and yellow ribbon, which Evelyn always thought was a strange choice. Yellow being the color of caution, of fever, of things gone wrong. But nobody asked her opinion on decorations. Nobody asked her opinion on much of anything. She stood near the back wall with her hands folded in front of her, wearing the blue dress she'd spent 3 weeks mending. The hem was nearly perfect now. You had to know where to look to see the old tear. She knew where to look. She always did. Black Hollow's autumn matchmaking gathering happened every year in the Aldrich barn, which was large enough to hold 60 people and smelled permanently of hay and old timber regardless of how many candles you lit or how much pine you dragged in from the tree line. The Aldrich family owned the biggest grain operation in the valley. They hosted the gathering because it made them look generous, and they liked looking generous. Everyone understood this arrangement. Everyone attended anyway, because winter was coming and loneliness in the mountains was its own kind of slow death. Evelyn was 24 years old. She had attended this gathering 3 times before. Each time she'd left alone. This year felt different only because she'd told herself it would. That was the lie she'd constructed on the walk over. Her boots crunching frost-stiffened grass, her breath making small clouds in the October air. The quiet negotiation she'd made with herself. This year is different. You are different. You have more to offer than you did at 21. She had more to offer. She knew her numbers better than half the men in the county. She could run a household on almost nothing, had been doing exactly that for the past 4 years since her mother passed, and her father, Gerald Mercer, had surrendered to the bottle in a long and graceless way that the entire town had witnessed. She could preserve meat, patch a roof, negotiate credit at the supply store, and still find time to read whatever dog-eared book she could borrow from the schoolteacher on the far end of Main Street. None of that was what men in Black Hollow were looking for. What they were looking for was a clean name and a father who didn't owe money to half the businesses on the main road. The first man was Dale Pruitt, who ran a small cattle operation 2 miles outside of town. He was polite about it, which was somehow worse. He walked up, shook her hand, said, "Miss Mercer?" and then looked somewhere past her left shoulder and said he didn't think they'd be a practical match. Practical. Like she was a piece of equipment he'd assessed and found deficient. "I appreciate your honesty," she said, "because what else do you say?" He nodded and moved on to Clara Winfield, who had a father who owned the feed store and a laugh like a dinner bell. Clara was nice enough. Evelyn didn't blame Clara for any of it. The second man didn't bother with a reason. He just shook his head and kept walking, which was its own kind of statement. The third man, she didn't know him well. A younger farmer named Bo something, new to the valley, actually looked sorry about it. He said, "I heard about your father's situation," and Evelyn understood immediately that this was not going to lead anywhere good. He confirmed it by taking a half step back and offering something about it being complicated. "It's not that complicated," Evelyn said, quietly enough that only he could hear. "You've made a decision, and you're dressing it up. That's fine. You can just say no." His face went red. He said no and walked away faster than he needed to. She was aware by the third rejection that people were watching. The barn had a particular social acoustics to it, voices bouncing off the high rafters, conversations layered over each other, the scraping of boots on the plank floor. But human attention has its own frequency, and she could feel it turning toward her the way sunflowers turn toward heat. Except sunflowers turn toward warmth. This was something colder. Margaret Hollis, who ran the dry goods store and had opinions about everything, leaned toward her friend near the refreshment table and whispered something that made the friend press her lips together to keep from laughing. Evelyn saw it. She was getting good at seeing things people thought they were hiding. The fourth man didn't approach her at all. He'd been pointed in her direction by someone. She saw the exchange, the subtle head tilt toward her, and he'd looked at her for a full 3 seconds before shaking his head and drifting away toward the punch bowl. That one landed differently. Not an assessment and a rejection. just a refusal to even make the attempt. Evelyn kept her face arranged in something she hoped looked like composure. She thought about her dress, the mended hem, 3 weeks of careful work with a needle that had gone blunt and needed resharpening twice. She thought about the way she'd brushed her hair out longer than usual and pinned it differently, trying for something that looked less tired and more arranged. She thought about the small pot of rosewater she'd applied to her wrists because it was the only thing resembling perfume she owned left over from her mother's things. She thought, I should go home. She stayed. She stayed because going home early meant walking past people who would watch her leave and would understand exactly what that exit meant. Staying was humiliating. Leaving was worse. The fifth man was Thomas Ackerley, who owned the sawmill and fancied himself the most eligible widower in the valley, a self-assessment that approximately half the valley agreed with. He was 41, which was fine, and had a son of 12 from his first wife, which was also fine. He was not unkind. He approached Evelyn with the careful, measured energy of a man doing something he considered a charity, and that single quality, the charity of it, turned her stomach before he'd said a word. I heard you're good with numbers, he said. I am, she said. My books are a mess. My first wife handled all of that. She looked at him steadily. I imagine you're looking for a wife, not an accountant. He laughed a little awkwardly. Well, the two aren't mutually exclusive. No, she agreed. But the way you said it suggests you've already decided the numbers are the most interesting thing about me, which is either an insult or a very narrow way of seeing people. He blinked. He hadn't expected that. Nobody in these gatherings talked like that. I only meant, I know what you meant, she said. Thank you for stopping. He drifted away looking faintly unsettled, and Evelyn felt the small private satisfaction of having meant it. She didn't want Thomas Ackerley. She hadn't wanted any of these men in any deep sense. What she wanted was to not be standing alone in this barn while the room watched her collect rejections like a woman at a raffle with losing tickets. What she wanted was to matter to someone in a way that didn't feel like they were doing her a favor. The sixth and seventh men she barely registered. One was perfunctory, one was apologetic. By that point, she was running out of ways to arrange her expression into something that didn't look like what it was. And she kept her eyes on the middle distance and nodded and said the polite, reasonable things you say. When the seventh man walked away, Margaret Hollis didn't bother whispering this time. Someone should tell her, Margaret said to her friend, at a volume she absolutely intended to carry, that Gerald Mercer's daughter is going to end up alone in that house. It's just the way of things. The way of things. Evelyn stared at the pine boughs on the wall. Yellow ribbon, wrong color from the start. She was deciding in a calm and absolute way that she was done with this barn, done with this gathering, done with the particular exercise of standing in a room full of people and being found wanting, when the doors blew open. Fatut, not metaphorically. The actual barn doors blew open. The October wind came in hard and cold, knocking a pine bough off its hook and sending a woman's shawl skidding across the floor. Candles guttered. Conversation stopped mid-sentence. Heads turned. In the doorway stood a man Evelyn didn't recognize. He was very large. Not in the soft, broad way of men who ate well and worked occasionally, but in the manner of something that had been built by weather and work over a long time. Wide-shouldered, thick-armed, carrying height like it was just a feature of the landscape. He wore a heavy canvas coat darkened by use and had wolf pelts draped over one shoulder, stiff and silver gray, the kind of pelts that came from the high country where most men didn't go. There was a long, still healing cut along his jaw. His hands, even from across the barn, looked like they'd been used hard. He looked around the room the way a man looks at territory he's assessing, not celebrating. Someone near the door said his name in a hushed voice. Evelyn caught it. Calloway. Thorne Calloway. She didn't know the name. She'd been living in the valley long enough to know most of the ranchers, farmers, and tradesmen in the region, but Thorne Calloway wasn't from the valley. That was immediately clear. He was from somewhere higher up, somewhere further out, somewhere most people in this barn hadn't been and wouldn't consider going. He stepped inside and the doors settled behind him. The barn's social machinery, which had stuttered to a stop at his entrance, slowly began moving again, but quieter now, more cautious. The men watched him with a particular kind of male attention that wasn't quite fear and wasn't quite respect, but lived in the neighborhood of both. The women watched him with a different kind of attention that Evelyn recognized but didn't dwell on. He set the wolf pelts down against the far wall, unhurriedly, like a man who'd learned there was no point in rushing most things. Then he straightened up and looked across the room again. His gaze moved over the women who were, by any of Black Hollow's measures, the most desirable matches present. Clara Winfield, with her father's feed store and her dinner bell laugh. Judith Crane, who'd come into a small inheritance. The Aldrich daughter, Helen, who'd spent most of the evening surrounded by interested men, and the comfortable confidence of a girl who knew she wouldn't go home alone. His gaze moved past all of them. Evelyn felt it before she processed it. The specific sensation of someone looking directly at you when you've spent the last 2 hours trying to be invisible. Thorne Calloway walked across the barn. The crowd parted for him the way crowds part for large animals in serious weather. Not dramatically, just a natural, unconscious adjustment of bodies giving way. He walked without looking at anyone else. He stopped in front of Evelyn. Up close, he was even more himself. There was a weariness in his face that wasn't weakness. It was the look of a person who'd been responsible for hard things for a long time. His eyes were a dark, level gray, and they were looking at her with a directness that made her want to step back and step forward simultaneously. "You're Gerald Mercer's daughter," he said. His voice matched his size, low and unhurried. She kept her spine straight. "I am. Word is you've been managing his operation since he went under." That was a blunt way to put it. She respected blunt. "His situation has been difficult. Yes, I've been managing the household." "You know how to work." It wasn't a question, but she answered it. "I know how to work." He was quiet for a moment, assessing something. Then he said, "I've got 200 acres above the timberline on the North Ridge. Silver deposits on the eastern face. I've been working it alone for 8 years, and I'm at the point where one person isn't enough. I need a partner." The barn was not quiet in the way barns become quiet when everyone has stopped to listen. It was making all its normal sounds, but Evelyn had the distinct impression that the radius of normal barn sound had shrunk considerably around the two of them. "A partner," she said. "Equal share of the work, equal share of the territory, equal decision-making. What gets built up there gets built by both of us." He paused. "I'm not looking for someone to cook and nod. I'm looking for someone who can pull their half of the load and then some when it needs to happen." She looked at him. She didn't rush it. She thought about the seventh man who'd walked away without a word. She thought about the way of things delivered at Carrying Volume by Margaret Hollis. She thought about her father's whiskey bottles lined up behind the wood stove like a private gallery of failure, and the way the house smelled of both, in a combination so familiar it had stopped registering as anything other than home. She thought about the look on Thomas Ackerley's face when she'd set a very narrow way of seeing people, and the small, fierce satisfaction of it. She thought, 200 acres above the timberline. She said, "What's the territory like?" Something moved in his expression that might have been approval. "Brutal," he said. "I'll be honest with you, it's brutal. Most of the year it wants to kill you. Winter up there is nothing like winter down here. We're above the storm line. Food runs out if you haven't planned well. The work is physical and unrelenting, and there are stretches where the only other person you'll speak to is me, which, depending on your preference, may or may not be a selling point. And you're telling me this why? Because I don't want someone who agrees to something they don't understand. That wastes both our time." She considered this. Outside somewhere, the wind pushed at the barn walls. The candles near the door flickered. "You walked past every woman in this room," she said. "Why?" "I watched the room for a while before I came in." And most of them want what's comfortable. What I'm offering isn't comfortable." He didn't say it with any judgment toward the other women, just fact. "You've been running a household under bad conditions for years and you've kept it standing. That tells me something." "It tells you I can endure," she said. "That's not the same as thriving." "No," he agreed, "but it's a start, and you can learn the rest." She looked at him for another long moment. The barn existed around them with its candles and its yellow ribbon and its quiet, attentive audience. Then she said, "I have conditions." He didn't flinch. "Tell me." "Equal voice on decisions. Not in theory, in practice. If I disagree with something, we discuss it. I don't get overruled because you've been on the mountain longer." "Agreed." I need time to arrange things for my father before I leave. I won't go until he has provisions for the winter and someone checking on him. How long? A week, maybe 10 days. I can wait. And one more thing. She held his gaze. If this arrangement isn't working, for either of us, we say so plainly and figure out what comes next. No silence, no pretending. We deal with problems when they're small. He looked at her for a moment that felt longer than it probably was. You've thought about this kind of arrangement before, he said. I've thought about a lot of things, she said. I've had time. He put out his hand. It was a large, scarred, calloused hand, the hand of a man who'd been living close to the mountain for a long time. We have a deal, Miss Mercer. She shook it. His grip was firm without being performative. Evelyn, she said. Thorn. Somewhere behind them, Margaret Hollis had stopped talking entirely. The next 10 days were the busiest and strangest of Evelyn's recent life. She went home that night and sat at the kitchen table for a long time in the dark, not quite processing what had just happened, not quite disbelieving it either. The house smelled like whiskey and wood smoke. Her father was asleep in the back room. She could hear him breathing through the wall, slow, heavy, the breathing of a man who'd had too much again. She lit a candle and wrote out a list. Not of reasons to go, not of reasons to stay. Just a list of what needed to happen in 10 days if she was going to leave responsibly. Provisions. Wood. The Hendersons next door, who were decent people and would check in if she asked them plainly and directly. Gerald's credit at the supply store, which needed to be addressed before she left, because if it wasn't, he'd simply run it up to a number, the store would stop extending, and then he'd have nothing. The list helped. It always helped to make a list. She didn't sleep much that night. She lay in the dark and thought about the mountain, which she'd seen from the valley floor her whole life. The North Ridge, dark and high, often disappearing behind cloud cover in winter. She'd thought of it as scenery, part of the permanent backdrop. 200 acres of it apparently belonged, in some working and legal sense, to Thorne Calloway, and in one more week would belong in equal measure to her. She thought about the look on his face when she'd said she had conditions. Not irritation, not surprise exactly, something more like acknowledgement, as if he'd expected it and was quietly satisfied to be right. She thought about his hands, the scars on them, the healing cut on his jaw. Whatever had happened to him up there, it had left marks, and he hadn't felt the need to explain them or minimize them. They were just there, part of him, evidence of a life being lived in a particular and demanding way. She thought, most of the year it wants to kill you. She thought, you can learn the rest. She fell asleep eventually and dreamed about nothing she could remember. The next morning, she went to the supply store and had a direct conversation with Franklin Cole, who ran it, about her father's account. Franklin was not an unkind man. He was also not a man with infinite patience for debts that showed no signs of shrinking. They worked out an arrangement. Evelyn would settle the existing balance before she left, using money she'd saved from taking in mending over the past year, and Gerald's future credit would be capped at a number Franklin agreed to hold fixed regardless of what Gerald said or how persuasively he argued. He'll argue persuasively, Evelyn said. I know, Franklin said. I'll hold fixed anyway. I appreciate it. Where are you going, if you don't mind my asking? She told him. Franklin looked at her for a moment with the particular expression of a man recalibrating something. Thorne Calloway, he said. You know him? Comes down for supplies twice a year, never stays longer than he needs to, pays in silver, always. Franklin paused. He's not an easy man. No, she agreed, but I wasn't looking for easy. Look, she saw Thorne twice in those 10 days before the departure, once in town where they confirmed logistics without any ceremony. She'd meet him at the North Trailhead at dawn on the 11th day. She should pack for cold and for weight. She should bring whatever books she valued because resupply runs were infrequent and winter was long. Once at her house, where he brought over a pack of supplies she hadn't asked for but was glad to have, dried meat, a spare pair of winter gloves that were too large but better than nothing, a knife in a worn leather sheath. You didn't have to, she started. You're coming up underprovided, he said, matter of fact. This helps. He didn't stay long. He looked at the house. The small listing structure with its weathered boards and the smoke coming thin and pale from the chimney. and she watched him look at it and understood that he was seeing the whole story of the last 4 years in about 30 seconds. He didn't say anything about what he saw. She was grateful for that. She had a harder conversation with her father. Gerald Mercer, when sober, was a man of genuine intelligence and deep, abiding sadness, and Evelyn could see both of those things in his face when she sat across from him at the kitchen table and told him what she was doing. He was 61 years old and looked older. He'd been a reasonably successful livestock trader before the drinking accelerated. The town's memory of him was layered, the respected man underneath the embarrassing one, and most people in Black Hollow had settled on only seeing the surface layer. She told him about Thorne, about the mountain, about the equal partnership. She told him about the arrangements she'd made, the Hendersons, Franklin at the supply store, the wood stacked by the side of the house, the provisions in the root cellar. She told him she wasn't leaving because she didn't care. She told him she was leaving because she couldn't stay in the same place forever waiting for both their lives to change. Gerald listened without interrupting. When she finished, he looked out the window at the gray October sky. "The North Ridge," he said. "Yes. That's Callaway territory. I knew his father, a little, decades ago." He paused. "Hard family. They built something up there. He's still building it." Her father looked at her. There was something in his face that she hadn't seen in a while. Not pride exactly, because the situation wasn't quite right for pride. More like recognition. Like he was seeing her clearly for a moment through whatever haze had settled over everything. "I'll try," he said. "I can't promise you more than that." "Trying is enough," she said. "It's a start." She didn't hug him when she left the next morning. Their relationship had grown too careful for that, too armored. But she put her hand on his shoulder briefly before she walked out, and he put his hand over hers for a second, and that was its own kind of language. Dawn on the 11th day was cold and pale and tasted like ice. Evelyn stood at the north trailhead with 2 packs, one on her back, one at her feet, and her breath making small clouds and her hands already cold inside the 2 large gloves. The valley was quiet. A dog barked somewhere on the far side of town and then stopped. Thorne arrived on horseback, leading a second horse, 15 minutes before she'd expected him. He looked at her standing there with her packs and said nothing for a moment, which she was learning was simply how he operated. Not unfriendly, not warm, just present and observing. "You packed well," he said, assessing the bags. "I made a list," she said. Something in his expression shifted slightly. Not a smile exactly, but the suggestion of one. He helped her with the second pack. They mounted up. The trail rose immediately, steeply, heading north and up into the tree line where the aspens had gone bare and gold scraps of their leaves still caught in the branches like the last evidence of something that used to be beautiful. The valley fell away behind them. Evelyn didn't look back. There was no point in it. The valley was the valley, and it would be exactly what it was when she returned, and looking back would only make the going harder without making anything better. She looked forward instead, up into the trees, up toward the ridge, where the sky was still dark and the first pale stars were fading at the edges of the morning. The mountain was up there, waiting. She went to meet it. They rode for most of that first day with limited conversation, which suited Evelyn well enough. She was busy cataloging the terrain, the way the trail narrowed above the aspen line, the shift in air temperature as they gained elevation, the change in the trees themselves from aspens to firs to something more sparse and weather-beaten near the upper reaches. She was building a mental map. She'd always been good at mental maps. By midday, they'd stopped eating lunch without getting down from the horses. Dried meat, hard biscuit, water from a stream so cold it hurt her teeth. Thorne drank from it like it was fine. "Does it bother you?" she asked. "The cold?" He looked at her sideways. "It did the first few winters. You get calibrated." "Calibrated," she repeated. "Your body learns what it needs to be." He paused. "Or it doesn't, and then you've got a problem." "What kind of problem?" "The kind where you don't make it through February." She looked at the mountains ahead of them. "That's direct. No point in pretending the mountain is something other than what it is." She filed this away alongside everything else she was filing away. He was not easy to read, Thorne Callaway, but he was consistent, which was its own form of legibility. He said what he meant. He didn't dress things up. She could work with that. "What happened to your jaw?" she asked. He touched the healing cut briefly. Came down off the ridge wrong 2 weeks back. Icy switchback, horse slipped. I went over the side about 8 feet before I caught on a ledge. 8 feet. Give or take. And you came back up. Wasn't much else to do, he said. Then, the horse was fine before you ask. She hadn't been about to ask, but she appreciated that he'd thought she might. Good, the horse is important. Everything up here is important. That's what you'll understand eventually. Nothing is minor. Nothing is incidental. Every detail counts. She was quiet for a moment, thinking about that. Then she said, "That sounds exhausting." "It is," he said. "You stop noticing eventually. It just becomes how you think." What? They reached the homestead as the light was failing. It was not what she'd imagined, which had been unclear in any case. She hadn't built a strong picture of what to expect. She'd tried to keep her expectations deliberately unspecific. Better to see the actual thing than to be correcting an imagined version of it. The actual thing was this: a log cabin, solidly built, low to the ground, in the manner of structures that had learned to stop arguing with the wind. A barn that was smaller than the cabin but structurally sound. A series of outbuildings she couldn't quite identify in the failing light. Storage, she guessed? Maybe a smokehouse. The whole arrangement was tucked into the lee of a granite outcropping that served as a natural windbreak, which meant someone had thought carefully about where to put it. Thorn had thought carefully about where to put it. She dismounted and her legs protested. She'd ridden before, but not like this. 7 hours of serious elevation gain on mountain trails. Her thighs felt like she'd been wringing them out. She didn't show it. She unsaddled her horse and did the work, following Thorn's movements when she wasn't sure of procedure, not asking questions she could figure out herself. Inside, the cabin was sparse and functional. A stone fireplace that took up most of one wall. A rough table, 2 chairs. A shelf of tools and equipment organized with what appeared to be a rigid system she didn't understand yet. Dried herbs hanging from the rafters. A second room at the back, which turned out to be a sleeping loft reached by a wooden ladder. "I'll take the loft," she said. He nodded. She climbed up and looked around at what would be her space. A bed frame with a rope base, a straw mattress, 2 wool blankets, a small window that faced east, and a wooden peg on the wall. It was the most Spartan accommodation she'd seen since some hard months in her father's house when things had gotten particularly lean. She set her pack down and sat on the bed and listened to the wind come off the ridge. It was different from the valley wind. Lower, with more texture to it, like it was carrying something the valley wind didn't know about. Below, she heard Thorn moving around the cabin, the creak of the fireplace damper, the scratch and catch of a match, the smell of smoke beginning to work its way up through the boards. She looked at the small east window. Tomorrow, she thought, the sun would come in through that window and light this room, and she would begin learning what this life required of her. And she would learn it because that was the only option. She had not come up here to fail. She had not come up here to be someone's burden. She had come up here to earn something. She lay back on the straw mattress and listened to the mountain wind and did not sleep right away, but did not lie awake worrying either. She lay awake the way you lie awake before something hard and necessary begins, with a clear mind and a body paying attention, trying to understand what was coming. Outside, the north ridge stretched above them in the dark, indifferent and vast. It did not care about her name or her father's name or the 7 men who'd turned their backs in a decorated barn. She found that she liked that about it. The first week nearly broke her. Not in any dramatic way. No single moment of crisis, no collapse in the snow. It was quieter than that, and in some ways harder. It was the accumulation of small failures that nobody warned you about because they were too ordinary to seem worth mentioning until you were in the middle of them. The first morning she woke before dawn to the sound of Thorn already moving below. Boots on the floor, the clank of the iron stove, the particular silence of a man who'd been operating alone long enough that he'd stopped accounting for anyone else's schedule. She climbed down from the loft stiff in every joint, her legs still complaining from the ride up, and found him crouched by the fireplace adding wood with the focused economy of someone who'd done this 10,000 times. He looked at her. "Sleep?" "Some," she said. "Good enough." He handed her a tin cup of something that turned out to be hot water with dried pine needles steeped in it, which was not coffee, but was hot and had a sharp, resinous taste that woke her up anyway. "We start with the trap line this morning. 4 miles east, loops back north. You'll follow and watch today." "And tomorrow?" Tomorrow you do half of it, while I do the other half. She drank the pine needle tea. It tasted like the forest smelled. And if I do it wrong? Then the traps don't work and we don't eat as well this week. He said it without heat, just consequence. So try not to do it wrong. The trapline took them across terrain that looked uniform at first glance and revealed itself as deeply specific the longer she was in it. The ground varied, frozen solid in the exposed places, treacherously soft where sun reached it in the afternoon, and refroze overnight into a crust that would hold for 3 steps and then give way. The trees told you things if you were looking. A spruce bent at an odd angle meant persistent wind from a specific direction. A stretch of disturbed snow meant something had moved through it recently, and the shape and spacing of the disturbance told you roughly what and how long ago. Thorn talked while they walked, which surprised her. She'd have guessed he was a silent man on the trail, operating privately in his own assessment of the landscape. Instead, he narrated in a low and matter-of-fact way everything she was looking at. See the ground there? The slight depression? That's a travel path. Small animals use the same routes when the snow gets deep. They can't afford to break trails, so they don't. You set here, not 10 feet east where it looks more obvious. Why does it look more obvious over there? Because that's where we've been walking. Our tracks make it look like the route. But we came that way. The animals don't know that. They're using the actual low-resistance path, which is the depression. She looked between the 2 spots. She'd have set the trap in the wrong place without question. How do you know which tracks are old? He crouched down and pointed to the edge of a print in the snow. Fresh tracks have clean edges. The crystals haven't had time to sublimate. Old tracks go soft at the edges. The detail collapses. Yesterday's tracks look like today's if you're not paying attention. This one is, he tilted his head, 6-7 hours. Overnight. She crouched next to him and looked at it. A small, 4-toed print, sharp-edged around the claw marks, slightly softer at the heel pad. Rabbit, she said. Snowshoe hare, bigger than a rabbit. Different movement pattern. He glanced at her. You know the difference? I'm learning the difference, she said. Something in his expression acknowledged this as an acceptable answer. By the end of that first week, she had calluses forming on calluses she'd had since childhood. Her shoulder ached from carrying weight in ways she wasn't accustomed to. She'd reset 3 traps wrong, and Thorn had corrected them without comment, just kneeling in the snow and adjusting the mechanism and standing up again. The lack of reproach was its own kind of pressure. She'd have almost preferred to be told directly that she'd gotten it wrong. Silence made her accountable to herself, which was harder. She did not complain about any of it, not because she was performing toughness, but because complaining would have required energy she needed for other things. What she hadn't expected was how much of the work was cognitive. She'd thought of mountain life as physical, and it was, relentlessly. But the physical work ran on mental infrastructure that had to be built from scratch. Where does water come from when the creek is frozen solid? You know where the seeps are, the places where groundwater moves too fast to freeze completely. How do you know where the seeps are? You mapped them in autumn before the freeze, when Thorn had walked her across the territory one afternoon and pointed without explaining, trusting her to understand that she was supposed to be memorizing. She'd memorized. She'd gone back the next morning alone and walked the route again and built the map more carefully in her head. Thorn noticed. He didn't say anything directly, but the quality of his attention toward her shifted slightly around the end of the first week. Less monitoring, more collaboration. It was small. She noticed it anyway. One evening, she was at the table working on a notation system for the trap placements, mapping them out on a scrap of paper so she could track which ones were producing and which weren't. And he came in from the barn and stopped when he saw what she was doing. That's useful, he said. I thought it might be. Right now, it's all in your head, which means if something happens to you, it's gone. Written down, it stays. He pulled out the second chair and sat across from her and looked at the map. Move this cluster here. He tapped a spot, about 40 yards northwest. The game path shifted after the first hard freeze. I haven't reset them yet. She made the notation. They worked on it together for an hour, him providing information, her organizing it into something that would be legible to anyone who needed to use it. It was the first time they'd worked side by side on something that wasn't physical, and the dynamic was different, easier in some ways, more careful in others. She could see how his mind worked when he was dealing with problems abstractly rather than physically, and it was not unlike her own mind, which she hadn't expected. "You're not what I thought you'd be," she said at some point. He looked up from the map. "What did you think?" More laconic. "I'm laconic when there's nothing worth saying." He went back to the map. "There's been things worth saying." She smiled at the paper in front of her. He didn't see it. The cold got worse in November. Not dramatically. It descended steadily, methodically, like a deliberate force rather than a weather pattern. Mornings dropped to temperatures she had no reference for, cold that went through clothing and found your bones before you'd had time to register that you were outside. She learned to layer in a specific order. She learned that the difference between adequate and inadequate preparation for the cold was not dramatic. One wrong decision about how many layers to put on before a 4-mile trapline walk could cost you severely before you'd gone a mile. "I lost 2 fingers to frostbite when I was 19, Thorne said one morning while they were gearing up. He said it conversationally, not for effect. She looked at his hands. She hadn't noticed before. The right hand, ring finger, and the one next to it, slightly shorter than they should have been. Not obviously, just enough. "What happened?" "Got caught out in a storm. Didn't plan well. I was young and thought I knew what I was doing." He pulled his gloves on. "Now I plan well." "Does it affect your grip?" "Some. I've compensated." He flexed the hand briefly. "You adapt to what you lose, and you stop thinking about it." She filed this away with everything else she was filing away. He gave her information about his past in these small installments. Not as intimacy, not as confession, just as relevant data for understanding the environment she was living in and the person she was learning to work alongside. She reciprocated in kind. One afternoon, she told him about her father's decline. Not the emotional version, not the version where she positioned herself as the suffering, loyal daughter, just the practical version. What had happened, what it had cost, how she'd managed it. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he said, "How old were you when it started getting bad?" 20. He lost a cattle contract he'd been counting on. The business didn't survive it. She paused. He was never a strong man in that particular way. Good in the good times, the bad times found the gap. "You kept the house." "I kept the house." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "My mother kept our house after my father died. 3 of us. She kept it going for 6 years until my brother and I were old enough to work full time." He paused. "People don't see that kind of work. It doesn't look like work to them." She looked at him. "No," she said. "It doesn't." They didn't say anything else about it. They didn't need to. It was in late November that he told her about August Vane. They'd come in late from a long day working the east face of the ridge. She was learning the silver deposits now, the way they showed in the rock, how to read the geological formations that indicated where to look and where not to bother. The work was slower and more technical than trapping, requiring patience she had in abundance, but a specific kind of spatial reasoning she was still developing. Thorne was better at it than he was at most things. He could look at a rock face and read it the way she read a page of text, and she was trying to learn that language. They came back to this cabin cold and tired, and she made what passed for dinner, dried beans with smoked meat, and a piece of flatbread she'd started making better since she'd figured out the temperament of the iron stove. He ate without comment, which she'd learned meant it was fine. Then he said, "You should know about August Vane." She set down her cup and looked at him. "He's a land speculator out of Crestfall, about 60 miles east. Has money, has lawyers, has influence with the county recorder's office. Or he did, last time I came down." Thorne's voice was level in the way of someone keeping it that way with deliberate effort. "He's been trying to acquire this ridge for 7 years. The silver. The silver, partly. Also the water rights on the north face. The creek that originates up here feeds 3 valley ranches downstream. Whoever controls the headwaters has leverage." He paused. "Vane understands leverage. And he's tried to take it legally? He tried a claim dispute first, said the original survey was faulty and the land was public. I fought that for 2 years. It cost me nearly everything I'd saved." His jaw was tight. "Then he tried to buy it, made 3 offers. Each one had language buried in it that would have given him access rights that amounted to operational control. I read them carefully." "Good thing you read carefully," she said. "My brother taught me that. He was the one with the head for paperwork." Something shifted in his face, not much, but enough. "Eli, He was 4 years younger than me. She waited. He died 3 winters ago. They said it was an accident. Fell on a trail coming down from the ridge. Hit his head on a rock. Thorne looked at his hands on the table. He'd spent the week before that going through the land records at the county office, trying to find evidence that Vane's survey people had falsified their measurements. The fire crackled. Outside, the wind moved across the ridge. "Did he find anything?" she asked quietly. "I don't know. Whatever he had it with him. Nothing came back with the body." He paused. The sheriff at the time ruled it an accident. Vane contributed generously to the sheriff's re-election campaign 2 months later. Evelyn was quiet for a moment, putting it together. "You believe it wasn't an accident?" "I believe my brother was careful on trails. He'd been coming up and down this mountain since he was 14 years old. Thorne looked up from his hands. "I can't prove it. I've never been able to prove it, but I believe it." She sat with that. The weight of it, the years of it, carrying that belief without being able to do anything with it. Working alone on this mountain with the knowledge that somewhere below, a man who'd likely had his brother killed was still building his resources and biding his time. "He'll try again," she said. It wasn't a question. "He'll try again," Thorne confirmed. "He always does. He's patient in the way that men with money and lawyers are patient. He can wait and keep trying until something goes his way. What I've had in my favor so far is that I know this land and he doesn't, and I've caught his surveyors twice trying to come up through the south approach and run them off." A pause. "It'll escalate. It already is. The last time I was in town for supplies, 2 months before I came to Black Hollow, a man I didn't know asked me pointed questions about the ridge's eastern extent. Professional questions. Someone hired. What did you tell him?" "Nothing useful." Thorne looked at her directly. "This is part of what you're coming into. I should have told you at the gathering. I meant to tell you earlier." She held his gaze. "Why didn't you?" He considered this for a moment. "Because I needed to know first whether you were someone who'd be useful in it, or whether the information would just frighten you." She felt the edge of offense at that, and then set it aside because it was an honest answer. He'd assessed her before trusting her with a problem. That was reasonable, even if the manner of it was blunt. "And now?" she said. "Now I think you'll be useful." She looked at the fire for a moment. Then she said, "I want to see the land records. Whatever you have. Deeds, surveys, anything related to his claim disputes. I have a box of documents in the back." "I'm good with documents." Something passed across his face. Not quite surprise, but a recalibration of some kind. "I know. That's partly why I'm telling you this now." They spent the rest of that evening with the document box between them on the table, Evelyn working through the papers with the methodical patience she'd learned doing accounts in difficult circumstances. Thorne answering questions and providing context. The records were not in good order. He'd been collecting them over years without a clear organizational system, because organizing documents had been Eli's domain, not his. She didn't say this, she just began sorting. What she found by the end of 2 hours was a picture of August Vane's tactics that was clearer than she'd expected. A pattern of manufactured claim disputes, slightly falsified survey measurements, strategic use of the county recorder's office that suggested either corruption or incompetence at that level. Nothing individually conclusive. Everything, taken together, suggestive of a sustained and deliberate scheme. "This isn't enough," she said. "What you have here. It suggests the pattern, but it doesn't prove it." "I know." "You need the original survey records from before he started interfering, and you need someone inside the county recorder's office or a lawyer willing to pull the historical filings." "I've thought about a lawyer. It costs money I don't have liquid right now." She thought about this. "The silver on the east face. How much?" "Enough. If it's properly extracted and documented and sold through legitimate channels, it's enough for lawyers and more besides." He paused. "That's been Vane's leverage. He knows I'm cash poor even if I'm land rich. He's waiting for me to get desperate enough to take a bad deal or make a mistake." "Then we don't get desperate," she said. "We work the east face properly this winter. We document everything. And in spring we go to town with something he can't buy his way around." Thorne looked at her across the table and the document box between them. "We," he said. "We," she said. "That's what equal partnership means." He nodded slowly. It wasn't agreement being offered as a courtesy. It was agreement reached by a man who'd been carrying something alone for a long time and had just, maybe for the first time, a reason to believe he didn't have to anymore. December arrived and the mountain shifted into a different register, harder, darker, more demanding of everything. The days shortened until there were only a few hours of real light, and those hours became the currency of productivity. They learned to move fast in the light and work by firelight when it was gone. She read in the evenings, she'd brought 4 books, and she rationed them. And sometimes he read too, from a small collection on the shelf above the tool rack. They didn't always talk. There were evenings of near total silence that weren't uncomfortable, which she found she appreciated. She'd always been able to be quiet. It was finding someone else who understood the value of it that was new. One night, deep in December, a storm came down off the ridge with no warning. She'd been in the barn checking on the horses when it hit. The temperature dropped 15 degrees in what felt like minutes, and the wind came in horizontal, and by the time she made it back to the cabin, she couldn't see more than 10 feet in any direction. Thorne was already inside. He looked at her when she came in, ice in her hair and her coat frosted white at the shoulders, and his face did something she hadn't seen it do before. A brief, unguarded expression of relief. "I heard it coming," he said. "I was about to come get you." "I made it," she said, pulling the door shut against the wind. "I know." But he'd been going to come anyway, which was its own kind of statement. She stood by the fire and let the ice in her hair melt, and outside the storm pressed against the cabin walls with all the impersonal force of a landscape that genuinely didn't care whether you survived it. She'd stopped being frightened of that impersonality. She was starting, in fact, to respect it. The mountain had no interest in her history, her father's name, or the 7 men in the Aldrich barn. It had no opinion about whether she deserved to be here. It presented the same conditions to her as it presented to everything else, and it would either break her or not based entirely on what she did with what she had. She found that fairer than anything she'd encountered in Black Hollow. She warmed her hands on her cup and listened to the storm work against the walls and thought, "I am learning what I need to know." She wasn't there yet. She made mistakes daily. Small ones, mostly, but real ones. The kind that on a worse day or in more extreme conditions could cost something significant. She knew that. She wasn't pretending she'd arrived at competence, but she was moving toward it with everything she had. And the distance between where she'd started and where she was now, measured in weeks rather than years, was real. Thorne sat across from her with his book open, but not reading, watching the fire with the settled look of a man who'd made peace, mostly with the kind of life he'd chosen and the costs that came with it. She thought about his brother, Eli, who'd had the head for paperwork and had died on a trail he'd known since he was 14. She thought about what it meant to carry that for 3 years alone, to come down twice a year for supplies and see a town that had moved on without noticing the weight of what he was carrying back up. She would help him with that weight. That was what the partnership meant, not just the work, not just the land and the silver and the documents, the weight too. Outside, the storm didn't care about any of it. Inside, the fire held. January on the North Ridge was a different animal than December. December had been harsh. January was something past harshness. It was the mountain at its most stripped down and honest. All pretense of gentleness gone. Nothing left but stone and wind and cold that had teeth in it. The storms came in sequences now, one behind the other with barely a day between them to assess damage and restock wood. Evelyn had stopped thinking about Black Hollow almost entirely. The valley felt like something from a different life, a place she'd read about rather than lived in. The mountain demanded all of her present tense. She'd gotten better. Not good. She was careful about that distinction, because overconfidence up here was the kind of mistake you didn't get to make twice, but meaningfully better. The trap line she could run alone now in conditions that would have stopped her cold in November. She read weather in a rudimentary way, catching the particular quality of light before a front moved in, the specific behavior of the horses when pressure dropped. She'd developed a working knowledge of the east face geology, enough to run the documentation Thorne needed while he handled the physical extraction work. Her flatbread had improved considerably. Small things, all of them, but they accumulated. Thorne noticed without saying so directly, which was his way. What changed was the nature of the work he gave her. Not easier work, harder work, work that required her to function independently rather than alongside him. The first time he sent her alone to check the North Trap Cluster, which was the furthest point of their range and technically the most exposed, She understood it was a test and completed it without hurrying and came back with accurate information about 3 of the 4 traps. The 4th she'd missed, concealed under fresh snow in a way she hadn't anticipated. "Missed the 4th," she told him when she got back. "I know, I checked it after you came in." He said it without emphasis. "The snow coverage is new. That trap gets buried in northeast wind events. You'll know it now." "I'll know it now," she agreed. What she didn't know and couldn't have anticipated was what was coming on the morning of January's 3rd week. It started ordinary enough. Thorne had gone out at first light to run the eastern section of the trap line, a longer loop that took 3 to 4 hours under good conditions. The sky that morning had the particular flat white quality she'd learned to associate with cold but stable weather. No storm incoming, reasonable visibility. She'd stayed at the cabin to work on the document organization, which she'd been building into something coherent over the past weeks. A proper record of the land's history, the surveys, the claim disputes, the evidence of Vane's interference. She was building the legal case the way she'd have built an accounting ledger, methodically, with sourced evidence for every claim, nothing asserted that couldn't be demonstrated. She was deep in it when she heard the horse. One horse, moving fast, which was wrong. Thorne moved carefully on the mountain trail. Speed meant something had happened. She was at the door before the sound fully registered. It was his horse coming up the south trail at a trot that wasn't quite controlled, reins loose and trailing, Thorne not on its back. Her stomach dropped 6 inches. She caught the horse by the reins and assessed it fast. No serious injury, breathing hard, one rear leg with a shallow cut that was bleeding but not badly. The saddle was still on. Something had thrown him or he'd come off, and the horse had found its way back alone. She thought, miles of trail between here and the eastern loop. A fall. Ice. The cut on the rock face above the second ravine where the trail narrows and the footing goes bad after a freeze. She thought, how long ago? She couldn't know how long ago. The horse was winded but had cooled some. 30 minutes, maybe. Maybe longer. She made a decision in roughly 4 seconds. She tied the returning horse, saddled the second one, her horse, the steadier of the 2 on technical terrain, grabbed the emergency pack from inside the door, the one Thorne had insisted they keep ready, and she'd thought was overcautious. Rope, medical supplies, spare blankets, fire kit. She swung up and pointed east and went. The trail was familiar to her now, in the way that trails become familiar when you've run them repeatedly in varying conditions. She knew where the ground shifted, where the ice formed worst, where the path curved and then dropped sharply before leveling into the ravine approach. She pushed the horse as fast as she dared on the upper section and slowed to careful when the terrain required it, fighting the urgency in her chest that wanted her to go faster than the conditions allowed. Faster gets you both killed. Careful gets you there. She found him 40 minutes out, below the second ravine, off the main trail by about 30 yards, in a direction that made no sense until she understood it. He'd gone over the edge of the trail at the curve and slid down the embankment, catching on a cluster of downed timber that had stopped him from going further into the ravine below. He was alive. She could see that from above. He was moving, trying to get up, not making it. Getting down to him was the first problem. The embankment was steep, and the snow covered what was underneath it, which could be stable ground, or could be rock, or could be nothing. She tied the horse high on a tree with enough slack to move but not enough to follow her, tested the embankment surface with her boot before committing to it, and went down sideways, grabbing at exposed branches and rock outcroppings as she descended. She reached him. He was half sitting against the downed timber, one arm held at an angle that was wrong. Not the grotesque wrongness of a bad break, but the careful, guarded positioning of something that had been badly wrenched. His right side. There was blood on the left side of his face from a gash above his temple, and when she got close enough to look at his eyes, they were tracking correctly, which was the most important thing. Thorne! She was kneeling in the snow beside him, her hands already moving to assess. How bad? Shoulder, he said. His voice was rougher than usual. Dislocated, I think. And ribs. 2, maybe 3. He took a careful breath to demonstrate, and she could see what it cost him. Head's fine. Hit it on something, but I didn't lose consciousness. Can you move your legs? Yes. He shifted to prove it, and then stopped moving because of the ribs. I need to get up. You need to not move for another 30 seconds while I figure out how to get you up that embankment, she said. He looked at her for a moment, that assessing look. The one she'd learned wasn't distrust, but simply his way of understanding a situation. Then he settled back against the timber and let her work. The embankment was the problem. In better conditions, with two functional people, it would have been difficult. With one functional person and one who couldn't use his right arm and could only breathe at partial capacity, it was going to be a problem that required solving carefully and in sequence. She untied the rope from the emergency pack and went back up the embankment, slower this time, taking real holds, assessing what was solid, and found two trees near the top with enough girth to anchor from. She rigged a line she could use as a handhold coming down and an assist going up, not a proper rescue system, nothing like what you'd want, but workable. She came back down and told him what they were going to do. "You're going to need to push with your legs," she said. "Your right arm is out. Use the left for balance only. Don't try to pull with it. The shoulder is going to make that worse." "You've done this before," he said. "I've read about it," she said, "which is not the same thing, so work with me." He almost smiled at that. She could see it at the edge of his expression before the pain pushed it back. Getting him up the embankment took 25 minutes and was the hardest physical thing she'd done in her life up to that point. She got below him on the steepest section and pushed with her shoulder against his back while he worked his legs, and she could hear what the movement did to his ribs and the quality of his breathing. Short, controlled, the breathing of a man managing pain with discipline. And she kept her focus on the next foothold and the next, and not on what would happen if the snow shifted under them. They made it to the top. He sat on the ground for a moment and breathed in the careful way, and she crouched next to him and breathed hard too because she'd earned it. "Can you ride?" she asked when he'd had a minute. "Yes." He looked at the horse. "I'll need help mounting." "I know." She helped him mount in a way that was graceless and effortful and required her to essentially take most of his weight for a critical 2 seconds while he swung his leg over and she had to brace herself hard against the horse's side to manage it. When he was seated, he gripped the saddle horn with his left hand and held his right arm against his ribs and didn't say anything for a moment. "Evelyn." She was already checking that the emergency pack was secured to the saddle. "Yeah. Thank you." She looked up at him. He was pale under the cold, reddened skin, the gash on his temple still bleeding slowly, holding himself with the careful economy of a person in real pain. He said it simply, not dramatically, not with the excessive weight of someone performing gratitude. Just a plain statement. "Don't thank me yet," she said. "We still have to get you home." The ride back took twice as long as the ride out, because she led his horse at a walk the entire way and chose the smoothest available line on every section of trail, sacrificing speed for every small reduction in impact she could give him. He didn't complain. She checked on him every 15 minutes, brief questions, nothing taxing, and he answered in the same short, controlled way, giving her what she needed to know without wasting breath. Halfway back, it started snowing. Not heavily, but enough to reduce visibility and change the surface conditions under them. She kept moving. She'd done this trail enough times that she could feel the route through her feet and the horse's behavior more than she could see it. By the time the cabin appeared through the trees, she'd stopped feeling her hands inside her gloves. Getting him off the horse was its own challenge. Getting him inside and onto the bed in the main room, she'd pulled the bedding down from the loft, was another. She built the fire up high and then came back to him and started properly assessing what she was working with. The shoulder was dislocated. She'd seen a dislocation once before, years ago. A neighbor's son, fallen from a fence post. The same wrongness of angle. The ribs were harder to assess. She pressed carefully along his right side and he told her where it hurt and how much in a flat, clinical way that helped her more than stoicism would have. 2 ribs, she said. Maybe cracked, not broken through. The breathing is even. It's the shoulder that's the problem, he said. It needs to go back. She looked at him. I know how to do it. I've read the method. You've read the method, he repeated. Not mocking, just acknowledging the distance between reading and doing. The reading is accurate. The method works if it's done correctly. She met his eyes. I'm going to do it correctly. He held her gaze for a moment, then he lay back and said, All right. She took a breath and did not let herself think about the fact that this was the first time she'd attempted it on a living person, because that information was not useful right now. She positioned herself, placed her hands the way the description had specified, found his arm at the angle that was correct, and applied steady traction in the direction that should bring the joint back. Thorne made a sound she'd never heard from him before. Short, hard, involuntary. Then the joint moved, and the wrongness of angle corrected itself, and she felt the moment of reduction through her hands. She sat back on her heels. He was breathing. His face was white. "That's done," she said. "Yes," he said. He waited for a moment. Then, "That hurt." "I know it did." "You didn't hesitate." "Hesitating would have made it worse," she said. "Rest now. I need to splint the arm against your body so the shoulder holds." She worked for another hour, splinting, bandaging the head wound, getting water heated for something warm, doing all of it with methodical focus that left no room for the shaking she could feel at the edges of her hands wanting to start. She kept it at the edges. There was still too much to do. When it was done and he was settled and the fire was high enough to hold through the night, she sat in the chair beside the bed and let her hands shake for approximately 2 minutes. Then she pressed them flat on her thighs and breathed. Thorne was watching her. "You're allowed to be scared after," he said. "It doesn't undo what you did." She looked at him. "I wasn't scared during." "I know," he said. "That's what I mean." She thought about that. Outside, the snow was coming down heavier now, the mountain pulling its curtains closed for the night. The storm she'd smelled coming before they left for the trapline in the morning, she'd noted it and not mentioned it because the sky had looked clear, and now she understood she'd need to trust those early reads more, mention them even when the visible evidence didn't yet support the feeling. File it away. Learn from it. Move forward. "Sleep," she said. "Not yet." He shifted slightly, testing how much the ribs would allow, and settled. "I want to talk about Vane." She looked at him. "You want to talk about Vane right now? While I'm laid up is exactly the right time to think about what happens when one of us is incapacitated," he said. "We knew this was a vulnerability. Now we know it's real." She pulled the chair closer and rested her arms on her knees. He was right. She didn't like that he was right while bleeding from his temple and held together with strips of linen, but he was. "Tell me what he'll do," she said. "He'll send surveyors first. He always starts with surveyors. It gives him legal cover, establishes that he had a legitimate measurement process underway." Thorne's voice was steady, if slower than usual. "The survey team will come up through the south approach, probably 3 or 4 men, professional enough to know the mountain generally, but not specific to this terrain. They'll have paperwork authorizing a survey of disputed territory. The dispute being the fraudulent claim he filed. Right. And once the survey is filed, it creates a record that supports his ownership argument, even if the measurements are adjusted." He paused. "Behind the survey team, there will be men with different purposes, not official. His people. Armed. Armed." She thought about the terrain she'd been learning for 3 months. The south approach, which she'd ridden twice and walked 4 times, mapping it each time with the habit of attention she'd developed up here. The narrow section above the first switchback where the trail hemmed between granite walls and a sheer drop. The open section before the tree line where anyone coming up was visible for a 1/4 mile but had no cover. The creek crossing that was manageable in summer and treacherous in spring thaw. "How much time do we have?" she asked. "Before spring, they won't come. The trail conditions are too severe for a large group unfamiliar with the terrain." He thought for a moment. "February, maybe? March at the latest." "That gives us 6 weeks minimum." "6 weeks," he confirmed. She looked at the fire. 6 weeks. Thorne couldn't fully use his right arm for at least 3 of those weeks, and the ribs would limit him beyond that. Which meant for the immediate term, the physical work of the mountain fell to her, and the strategic planning had to happen now, while they could both think clearly. "I need to walk the south approach again," she said. "All of it. Every section." "I know. And I need the supplies inventory, what we have for materials, rope, tools, timber, anything that could be used to modify the trail." Box under the workbench in the barn, inventories written on the inside lid, it's current as of last month. She noted this. "The creek crossing before the tree line, can it be made impassable in a way that's reversible? So we can still use it, but an unfamiliar group can't." He looked at her with the expression she'd learned to read as genuine interest. "There's a way to redirect the flow using rocks and a temporary dam. I've thought about it. The approach channel can be made to look shallow where it's deep. A group on horses in a hurry falls through," she said. Or pulls up in time but loses confidence in the route, he said. Loses time. Time is what we need. Time and confusion. She was thinking out loud now, the problem opening up in her mind the way accounting problems opened up, all its components becoming visible, the relationships between them clarifying. We don't want a direct fight. We're outnumbered, and Vane has legal cover. What we want is to make this mountain so difficult and costly to move through that the surveyors can't complete a legitimate measurement, and his men can't establish a position. Yes, Thorne said. And while we're doing that, she continued, we need to get the documents we have down to a lawyer before they arrive. If we have a legal claim in progress when they show up, it changes what he can do through official channels. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, You've been thinking about this for a while. Since December, she said. Since you showed me the documents. He looked at her with something in his face she didn't have a name for yet. Not quite gratitude, not quite the particular relief of a person being seen clearly. Something that lived between those things. My brother would have liked you, he said. It came out simply, without calculation. She understood the weight of it. Eli, who'd had the head for paperwork and had died on a trail he'd known since he was 14, carrying evidence she was now reconstructing from fragments. Thorne didn't say things like that without meaning them exactly. Tell me about him, she said. And he did. Slowly, carefully, the way you talk about someone when talking about them is still a thing you do with your whole body. Eli, who'd been quick with numbers and quick with a joke, and who'd had a way of walking into a room that made it feel less serious than it had been. Eli, who'd argued with Thorne about everything and been right roughly half the time, and refused to concede the other half. Eli, who'd understood instinctively that the mountain was worth protecting not just for its silver, but for what it represented. Something built by their family against considerable resistance. Something that belonged to them in every real sense of that word. Evelyn listened without interrupting. The fire held. Outside, the snow came down on the north ridge with complete indifference to all of it, to grief and partnership and the long, unfinished business of a younger brother on a trail. But inside, something was shifting, not dramatically, not in a way that announced itself, but in the quiet, structural way that real things change. She was not the woman from the barn anymore, the woman standing alone while 7 men walked away. She wasn't sure she'd been that woman for a while now. She was someone the mountain had been making day by day out of cold and difficulty and work done without flinching. And in the morning, with Thorne laid up and the south approach to survey and 6 weeks of preparation ahead of them, she would go out and continue becoming her. She went out the next morning before full light. Thorne was awake when she came downstairs, propped against the wall with his arms strapped to his body and his color better than the night before, which was something. He watched her pull on her layers with the focused, sequential attention she'd developed. Base wool, middle insulation, outer canvas, everything in order, nothing rushed. South approach first, she said. Full walk. I'll be back by midday. Take the rifle. She looked at him. Not for Vane's people, he said. It's February. The cats come down low when the deer move. You're going to be in the lower timber alone for 2 hours. She took the rifle. The south approach in February was different from the south approach she'd walked in November. The same bones of terrain but wearing different clothing, the snow reorganized by months of freeze and wind into a landscape that looked familiar but had rearranged its details. She walked it slowly and in full attention, the way Thorne had taught her to walk any trail she was trying to understand rather than simply traverse. She was not walking toward a destination, she was reading. The first thing she confirmed was the creek crossing, 3/4 of a mile below the tree line. In February it was frozen solid, but the freeze was uneven. The upstream section, where the water ran faster over rock, had a glassy surface over still-moving water below. She crouched and pressed on it with her weight incrementally, and felt the flex before she was halfway committed. The downstream section, where the channel widened and slowed, was frozen through to the bottom. A group on horses, coming up in a hurry in March, when the surface had begun to soften, would not know that difference from above. They'd pick their line by what looked crossable. She could influence which section they chose. She spent 40 minutes at the creek, not doing anything yet, just understanding it, where the banks narrowed into something that funneled traffic toward the weak ice, where a redirect of the approach trail would make the downstream section harder to see and the upstream section obvious. The rocks needed for a subtle channel redirection were already there, the mountain providing its own materials. It would take half a day of careful work to set it up, and it would look like natural stream morphology to anyone who didn't know what they were looking at. She moved on up the trail and cataloged everything else with the same patience. The switchback section above the creek, where the trail went between the granite walls. She measured it with her stride, 6 feet wide at the narrowest, enough for a horse to pass but not to pass quickly. The overhang above the second switchback, where snow had loaded onto a natural rock shelf over the winter into a mass that could be encouraged to move with leverage and timing. Not to bury anyone, she was not planning for that, but to close the trail behind them, cut off retreat, create confusion and delay. The open quarter-mile before the upper timber was trickier. There was no cover for her there and no way to obstruct it without it being obvious. But she stood at the top of it and looked back down and understood that the open section was actually her advantage, not her problem. Anyone on that section was visible for minutes before they reached the timber. She would have warning. Warning was what she needed most. By the time she came back to the cabin, midday as she'd said, she had the shape of it in her head. Not every detail. Details would come as she did the work, but the architecture of it. How the mountain itself would do most of the work, if she set it up right. How a group of men unfamiliar with this terrain, moving with the confidence of people who believed they had legal authority and numerical advantage, would find the mountain systematically uncooperative in ways they couldn't attribute to deliberate resistance until it was too late to matter. Thorne was at the table when she came in. He'd moved from the bed, which she hadn't told him he could do yet, and she gave him a look that communicated this without words. "I'm fine," he said. "You're stubborn," she said. "Also that." He watched her shed the outer layers and pour water into the pan to heat. "Tell me what you found." She told him. All of it, in the organized, specific way she'd learned to report information up here. Facts first, assessment second, questions at the end. He listened without interrupting, which meant he wasn't finding fault as she went, which meant she was getting it right. When she finished, he said, "The creek redirect. You're thinking for March thaw conditions. The surface will be softening by then. Maybe not obviously. It'll still look frozen, but the upstream section will flex under a loaded horse. They'll pull up short, or they won't, and they'll go through. Either way, they lose time and confidence," she said. "That's all I need." He was quiet for a moment, turning it over. "The snow shelf above the second switchback. You can't trigger that from below without being on the trail. I can trigger it from the east face of the granite. There's a line above it. It'll take some climbing, and the angle is awkward, but I can do it with a long pole and enough leverage. I can position there before they arrive and wait." He looked at her steadily. "You've been up that face. 3 times. In November and twice in December." She met his eyes. "I know where the holds are." He didn't say anything for a moment. She could see him working through the same terrain in his memory, mapping what she was describing against what he knew. "It works," he said finally. "If you're positioned before they arrive. Which means I need the warning system from the open section." "Tripwire and cans," he said immediately, because he'd already been thinking about this. "Low to the ground, across the trail at the base of the open section. It won't stop them, and it won't alert them. They'll walk right through it and not notice. But the sound carries up to the east face approach." "How much time does it give me?" 12 minutes from the base of the open section to the second switchback. Maybe 10 if they're moving fast. 10 minutes. She filed it, calculated it against her positioning. "Enough," she said. "Barely," he said. "I work well with barely," she said. Something in his face, not a smile, but near one. They spent that afternoon and the next 3 days planning in detail, which was its own kind of work, methodical and collaborative, each of them contributing what they knew best. Evelyn, the terrain specifics, and the logistical sequencing, Thorne, the knowledge of Vane's previous tactics, and the physical properties of the materials they were working with. They disagreed twice. Once about the placement of a secondary deadfall trap on the North Spur Trail. She thought it unnecessary. He thought it essential as a fallback. They argued it for 15 minutes and landed on a modified version of his approach that addressed her concern about the time cost of building it. Once about whether to send the documents down to Black Hollow before the confrontation or after. She wanted before. To establish the legal position, he was worried about giving Vane's people warning through the town network. They sat with that one longer. The risk of sending early, she said, is that Vane hears we have a lawyer involved and accelerates his timeline. Yes. The risk of waiting, she said, is that something goes wrong up here and the documents never get down at all. He was quiet. The documents are the whole game, she said. Everything we're building on this mountain buys time, but time is only useful if the legal case is moving. She paused. We need both tracks running simultaneously. He looked at the fire. She could see him working through the reluctance. Not because he disagreed with the logic, but because trusting the Valley network meant accepting a variable he couldn't control, and control of his variables was how he'd survived up here for a long time. Franklin Cole, she said, at the supply store. He's discreet and he's not in anyone's pocket. I'd trust him to get the documents to a lawyer in Crestfall without talking about it. You trust him. I trust him within specific limits, she said. He's a man who protects his business relationships. Keeping confidence is part of how he operates, and he respects discretion because he practices it. She met Thorne's eyes. He won't talk to Vane's people. There's nothing in it for him. Thorne thought for another moment. Then, write the letter. I'll review it. She wrote it that evening. A careful, specific letter to Franklin explaining what needed to go to whom and by what route, including enough context that Franklin would understand the stakes without including anything that would be dangerous if the letter went astray. Thorne read it and changed 2 phrases and handed it back. The changes were good. She incorporated them. 3 days after the accident, she rode down to the first supply cache point, a halfway location between the cabin and the valley where she and Thorne had established a drop point for urgent communications, a metal box buried under a marked cairn that could be checked by either of them on a valley run. She left the letter there with a note of instruction, and 2 days later confirmed from the trail that the letter had been collected, meaning someone from the valley had been by on a scheduled run. The machinery was in motion. She came back to the cabin and told Thorne, and saw something in him relax by a small degree. Good, he said. Now we build, she said. The next 2 weeks were the most physically demanding of her life, which was saying something given the previous 3 months. Thorne was recovering, but still limited. His ribs kept him from full exertion, and his shoulder, while back in its socket, was rebuilding the surrounding muscle and would be unreliable under load for another month. She did the heavy construction alone. He could direct and he could handle light tasks, and he was relentlessly present in a way that would have frustrated her if it hadn't also been genuinely useful. His eyes on her work catching small errors before they became structural problems. The creek redirect took a day and a half. Moving river rocks in February was not a task she'd ever imagined doing, and it turned out to require a combination of leverage, patience, and a willingness to have soaking wet sleeves and air that was still well below freezing. She built a low rock deflection upstream that would encourage the natural flow toward the weak ice section. It was subtle. From 20 feet away, it looked like the creek had always run that way. From the opposite bank, Thorne said, looking at it when he came down to inspect. You cannot tell. That's the point, she said. Her sleeves were stiff with ice. She didn't mention them. He looked at her sleeves and didn't say anything about them either. The tripwire system across the open section took a morning. She used the thinnest wire from the supply box, so fine in the snow it was essentially invisible, strung at ankle height and connected at both ends to a line of cans she'd modified with small stones inside them to change the sound. Not a dramatic rattle. A soft, irregular clatter that would carry uphill in still air without sounding like an alarm to anyone who didn't know to listen for it. She tested it twice. Both times she heard it clearly from the position above the second switchback where she'd need to be. The snow shelf was the last piece and the most technical. She spent 2 days figuring out the approach on the east face of the granite. Not the climbing itself, which she'd done before, but the logistics of doing it quickly and in cold conditions while carrying a 10-foot wooden pole. Thorne watched her run the approach from below, unable to follow her up, his expression doing something she couldn't quite read. Stop watching me like I'm going to fall, she said from 15 feet up. I'm watching your hand placement on the third hold, he said. Move left 2 feet. The rock there is more stable. She moved left 2 feet and found that he was right, which she acknowledged by continuing upward without comment. When she reached the shelf and tested the leverage point, she found that the angle was better than she'd calculated from below. The loaded snow mass was larger than she'd estimated, months of accumulation, and the leverage required was less than she'd expected. A moderate push at the right point and the whole shelf would shear. She could do it with the pole from a stable position without overextending. She came back down and told him. "How stable is your position when you do it?" he asked. "Stable enough." He looked at her. "I'm braced against the granite. I'm not hanging out over anything. The movement is pushing away from me, not pulling." She kept his gaze. "I've thought about what happens if it goes wrong. I've got a line tied to a bolt I placed in the rock above my position. If I lose footing, the line holds me." He absorbed this. "When did you place the bolt?" "Yesterday, while you were sleeping." He was quiet for a moment. "You didn't tell me. You would have wanted to come up and check it," she said. "You're not cleared for that kind of climbing yet. The bolt is solid. I tested it 3 ways." She paused. "I'm not careless." "I know you're not careless," he said. "I know that." He looked away toward the granite face, and she could see him doing the things she'd watched him do before. The adjustment, the recalibration, the process of updating his understanding of what she was capable of against what he'd been used to accounting for alone. "I'm not used to trusting someone else's work up here." "I know," she said, "but you're going to have to." He looked back at her. "Yes," he said, "I am." It was the last week of February when the warning came. Not from the tripwire, too early for that, but from Franklin Cole via the cash point. A letter in Franklin's careful, spare handwriting. "Surveying party of 4 left Crestfall heading west 8 days ago. 3 additional men departed 2 days later by separate route. Your lawyer has filed. Move carefully." She read it standing at the cash point in the early morning cold, and then she read it again, and then she folded it and put it inside her coat and rode back up. Thorne was waiting at the cabin door. He could read her face by now. "They're coming," she said. "How long?" "A week? Maybe less." She handed him the letter. He read it and handed it back. "The surveying party and the other men are traveling separately. They want it to look like a legitimate survey with an unrelated group of travelers who happen to arrive in the same area." "It's how he's operated before," Thorne said. "The surveyors establish legal presence. The other men provide physical pressure. Both groups maintain plausible separation. So we treat them as one group," she said, "because they are one group." "Yes." She looked at the mountain around them, the granite faces, the timber, the creek below, the open section she could see from here as a thin, pale stripe between the tree lines. Everything she'd spent 2 weeks building into it, all the small adjustments that wouldn't be visible to anyone who hadn't put them there. It was not an army, and it was not a fortress. It was a landscape that she understood, and they didn't, modified with just enough strategic placement that understanding would matter when the time came. She thought about Eli, who'd had a head for paperwork, and had come down a mountain he'd known since childhood, carrying evidence he'd never gotten to use. She thought about 3 years of Thorne carrying that alone, working this land with no backup, no partnership, no one who knew the whole picture. She thought about 7 men in a decorated barn, and a woman standing alone near the back wall with her hands folded and her hem mended, and her future seeming very small. "Thorne," she said. He was looking at the mountain too. "Yeah. The lawyer has filed. Vane can't take this land through official channels anymore without fighting a documented legal claim." She paused. "What's coming up that mountain isn't a legal operation. It's intimidation." "It always was," he said. "Then we treat it like that." She looked at him. "We don't need to defeat them. We need to make this mountain cost more than it's worth." He looked at her for a moment. That level, assessing look that she'd come to understand was not reserve but a kind of respect, his way of seeing someone clearly. "When they get here," he said, "let me deal with the surveyors. I know the legal language. I know how to handle that side." "And I'll be on the east face," she said. "And you'll be on the east face." He paused. "You watch the tripwire. The moment you hear it, I'm already in position," she said. He nodded. She could see on his face what it cost him. Not the planning, not the danger, but the specific admission that the mountain defense had been built by her hands while he was the one recovering, that when the moment came, she would be in the more exposed position because she was currently the more functional person, and that this was simply how things were, and arguing with it would be stupid. "The ribs," she said. "How are they?" "Better." "Honestly," he met her eyes. 60%. maybe 65. That's enough for what you need to do, she said. Yes, he said. It is. They spent the last days of February doing final checks and waiting with the particular quality of patience that comes from having done everything you can do and knowing that the rest belongs to time. She ran the trap line because the mountain still required feeding regardless of what else was happening. She went over the creek redirect twice more and made one small adjustment to the rock placement. She confirmed the tripwire was still set and undisturbed by animals. She climbed the east face once more to confirm her position and found the bolt solid and the snow shelf loaded and the leverage point exactly where she'd left it. The night before it happened, she sat by the fire after Thorne had gone to the back room to sleep. And she sat in the quiet and the firelight and listened to the mountain breathe in the way it breathed at night. The long, slow creaking of timber, the wind at a different register than its daytime voice. The occasional sharp crack of ice somewhere in the distance doing what ice does in February. She was not the woman from the barn. She was not the woman who'd ridden up this trail in October with 2 large gloves and a borrowed knife, and a mental list of what needed to happen. She was not any of the versions of herself that Black Hollow had known, or dismissed, or pitied. She was the person that the mountain had made of her, which was turning out to be someone she didn't entirely recognize yet, but was starting to appreciate. Someone who could set a trap and tend a wound and read a rock face and build a legal case and hold her nerve when the situation required it. Someone who'd earned her place here foot by foot and cold morning by cold morning, and mistake by mistake and correction after correction. In the morning, men were coming up this mountain expecting to find a woman who'd gotten in over her head. They were going to find something considerably different. They came on a Tuesday, which Evelyn only knew because she'd been keeping a calendar scratched into the inside cover of one of her books since November, a habit of order in a place that otherwise measured time by weather and work rather than days of the week. The cans went off at 7:15 in the morning. She was already on the east face of the granite, had been there since before first light, positioned with the pole in her line clipped to the bolt above her, and her breath making small, careful clouds in the cold. She'd climbed up in the dark using memory, and her hands because she'd done it enough times that the holds were in her body now, not just her mind. She'd settled into position and waited with the particular stillness she'd developed up here. Not the stillness of someone suppressing movement, but the stillness of someone who'd learned that patience was a physical skill like any other, something you built through practice until it stopped feeling like endurance and started feeling like presence. When the soft, irregular clatter drifted up from below, she didn't move immediately. She counted. 1, 2. The sound continued. Not a single trip, but multiple contacts, a group moving through the wire without noticing it. She counted the rhythm of the contacts. 4, 5. Then a pause. Then 2 more. 7 people. Same count as Franklin's letter. The surveying party and the others, moving as one group despite the fiction of their separateness. She counted to 60 after the last contact, giving them time to clear the open section and enter the lower timber. Then she shifted her position and set the pole. Below, on the main trail, Thorne was waiting at the cabin's perimeter. She couldn't see him from here. They'd discussed this. He'd be visible when the group arrived, presenting himself as the landowner dealing with a legal matter, drawing their attention forward while she worked behind them. The surveying party would have their instruments and their paperwork. The other men would be watching Thorne and thinking about what they'd been sent here to do. Nobody would be watching the east face of the granite above the second switchback. She heard them before she saw movement below. The sound of horses on the trail, the low exchange of voices. Then the first riders appeared in the gap between the timber sections, coming up toward the switchback in a loose, confident group. Professional enough. Moving like men who'd done this kind of work before, who knew they had numbers and papers and a wealthy patron and who figured that translated into outcome. The surveyor at the front was consulting something, a map or a compass reading. He was young, younger than she'd expected, with the careful, slightly performative competence of someone who wanted to appear more certain than he was. Behind him were the other 3 survey men with their equipment. And behind them, not pretending particularly hard to be something else, were the 3 additional men. These ones rode differently, looser in the saddle, watching the tree line rather than the trail ahead. She waited until the lead rider was fully committed to the switchback section. The narrow granite walls on both sides, no room to turn a horse, forward the only viable direction. Then she put her weight on the pole and pushed. The sound the snow shelf made when it went was not the dramatic roar she'd half expected. It was a deep, sustained crack followed by a rushing that filled the entire east face, and the mass of it came down across the trail behind the last rider with a force that shook the granite under her hands and raised a white cloud that hung in the cold air for a long moment before settling. Nobody was buried. Nobody was hurt. She'd calculated the angle carefully. The mass fell across the trail 20 feet behind the rear riders, clean and complete, filling the switchback from wall to wall with snow and debris 8 feet deep. The horses went sideways and forward simultaneously, because horses are sensible animals and recognized that they'd just been cut off from retreat by a mountain's worth of white. The riders fought for control. The surveyor lost his map or his compass, or both. One of the 3 rear men's horses made it nearly 3 full sideways steps before the granite wall stopped that particular idea. In the controlled chaos of the next 90 seconds, nobody was looking at the east face of the granite. She unclipped her line, took her pole, and climbed down fast. She was in the timber above the trail before the group had their horses fully settled. From the tree line, she could see the trail clearly. The survey party and their companions had made it through the switchback and were now on the upper approach, which opened slightly, and they were doing what rattled people do: reorganizing, checking equipment, talking in the short, slightly elevated tones of men who'd just had something unexpected happen and were explaining to themselves why it wasn't a problem. The trail behind them was completely sealed. She moved through the timber parallel to the trail, staying above them and ahead of them, keeping to the line of trees where the footing was different from the open trail, quieter, with the snow packed by needlefall rather than wind. She'd walked this line a dozen times in preparation. She knew where the roots were, where the ground dropped, where a horse could follow, and where only a person on foot could go. The group reached the upper timber at a walk, pushing through the last stand of trees before the final open approach to the cabin and the ridge above it. The surveyor had recovered his composure and was talking to the man riding next to him, something about bearing and measurement points. The 3 rear men had spread out slightly, flanking formation, not subtle about it. They did not look up at the ridge line to their left. If they had, they would have seen that the approach to the east face, the route to the silver deposits, was threaded with everything she'd spent 2 weeks placing. Deadfall triggers, pressure-set snares sized for horses rather than game, a narrow section above the creek where the trail surface looked solid and wasn't. None of it designed to seriously injure. All of it designed to stop, delay, confuse, and cost time to anyone who didn't know exactly where to step. She came out of the timber at the cabin perimeter 30 seconds before the group arrived in the clearing. Thorne was standing in front of the cabin with his left hand visible and his right arm still strapped, which she'd told him to leave visible because a man with a visibly injured arm read as less threatening and therefore less likely to escalate the other side's posture. He'd looked at her when she'd said this with an expression that was equal parts acknowledgement and mild exasperation. "Calloway," the surveyor said, pulling his horse up short when he saw Thorne. He'd expected to arrive. He hadn't expected the sealed trail behind him, or the woman who'd emerged from the tree line and was now standing 6 feet to Thorne's right with a rifle carried in the easy, unthreateningly functional way of someone who was used to carrying one. "We have a survey authorization." "I know what you have," Thorne said. His voice carried the flat, certain quality she'd heard him use exactly once before. The voice of a man who'd been dealing with this particular problem for 7 years and was done being patient about it. "I've seen Vane's survey authorizations before. I know what they're worth and what they're not worth." The surveyor reached into his coat, slowly, the gesture of a man trying to look like he was being transparent. He produced a folded document. "This is a court-issued authorization. That authorization was issued by the county recorder's office," Evelyn said. The surveyor looked at her. The 3 rear men looked at her. The assessment in their expressions was quick and automatic, and she was used to that kind of assessment and had stopped caring about it. "The county recorder's office," she continued, "is currently the subject of a formal complaint filed 2 weeks ago by our attorney in Crestfall, documenting a pattern of altered survey records and fraudulent claim filings over a 7-year period. That complaint includes specific reference to any survey authorizations issued in connection with the Calloway Ridge property." She paused. "Any survey conducted under that authorization today becomes part of a contested record. It has no legal standing until the complaint is resolved." The surveyor stared at her. "Who are you?" said one of the three rear men. He had the flat, economic voice of someone who did physical work for money and wasn't particularly interested in legal arguments. "Evelyn Mercer," she said, "equal partner and co-owner of this territory." The silence that followed had a particular texture, the silence of men recalibrating a situation that had not gone the way they'd been told it would go. They'd come up expecting to find one injured man and an easily managed problem. The trail behind them was 8 feet deep in snow. The woman with the rifle knew the legal file better than their own surveyor did. The injured man was standing in front of his cabin with 7 years of patience worn entirely through. The rear men looked at each other. This was the part of the job nobody had briefed them on. "You've been cut off from the south approach," Thorne said, in the same level voice. "The east face approach to the ridge is set. You're welcome to try it and see what happens, but I'd save yourselves the trouble." He tilted his head slightly. "The north face approach has been gated since October. I'd imagine your horses are tired." "We're not leaving," the flat-voiced man said. But there was something in it, not quite uncertainty, but the beginning of uncertainty, which was enough. "That's your right," Evelyn said. "You can stay on this approach trail for as long as you'd like. You cannot access the ridge, the east face, the north face, or the silver deposits from this position. You cannot complete a legal survey under a contested authorization. And if anyone in your group makes a physical move on this property, or either of the people standing in front of you, we have a detailed account of this visit, the names of everyone we can identify, and a lawyer in Crestfall who's currently very interested in any actions taken by parties affiliated with August Vane." She let that land for a moment. "The mountain has all winter. We're not in a hurry." The surveyor looked at his map. He looked at the sealed trail behind him. He looked at the east face approach where, if he knew what to look for, he might have been able to see some of what she'd built into it. He didn't know what to look for. He folded his map. The negotiation, such as it was, lasted another 20 minutes. The flat-voiced man tried twice more to establish a position. Vague references to what Vane wanted, vaguer references to what might happen if cooperation wasn't forthcoming, and each time Evelyn answered him with specific legal language and specific documentation references in a tone that was polite and completely unbending. Thorne said very little during this portion, which she'd asked him to do because his presence communicated everything it needed to communicate without words, and adding words risked escalation. Eventually, the surveyor said they would need to consult with their client about the legal situation. "That sounds like a good idea," she said. They turned their horses and went back down the trail, which meant finding a route around the sealed switchback, which took them another 40 minutes of struggling through the timber on the west side of the granite face. She watched them go from the tree line until they were out of sight and sound. Then she let out a breath that she'd been holding, metaphorically, for approximately 6 weeks. Thorne came to stand beside her. They looked at the trail where the group had been. "The flat-voiced one," he said. "He'll report back that it's not viable." "Not yet," she said. "Vane will need time to respond to the legal complaint. He'll recalculate." "Yes." Thorne was quiet for a moment. "You handled that better than I would have." She looked at him sideways. "You would have handled it fine." "I would have handled the physical part fine," he said. "The legal language, the documents, the specific references. I'd have gotten angry. Too much history with it." He paused. "You stayed even." "I've had practice staying even," she said. "Long practice." He looked at her. The way he looked at her now, which was different from how he'd looked at her in October, all the early assessment replaced by something else, something that recognized what it was seeing because it had watched it be built. "We should ride to Crestfall," he said, "before Vane has time to mount a second approach. We take the documents, we meet with the lawyer in person, and we file the full evidentiary record." "In spring," she said, "when the trail is clear." "In spring," he agreed. Spring came the way mountain spring always comes, not with the valley's green and gradual warming, but with a kind of violent unlocking, the snowpack releasing all at once over 2 weeks, the creeks running loud and brown with it, the trail south reforming itself in the mud and rock of the thaw. They were busy in a different way than winter, checking for damage, resetting what the snowmelt had shifted, documenting the east face silver deposits now exposed by the retreating snow. She'd been right about those deposits. They were significant. On the morning they rode down, she had the document case strapped behind her saddle. 3 months of organizing, the full evidentiary record, clean and indexed and sourced. She'd been over it so many times she could have recited it from memory. They rode the South Trail and she saw the creek crossing differently than she had in February. The redirect rock still in place, the channel running exactly where she'd put it, the false crossing still presenting its misleading surface to anyone who didn't know. She'd dismantle it on the way back up. For now, she looked at it with the quiet satisfaction of work that had done what it was designed to do. The valley appeared below them as they came down through the lower timber, the long green-brown stretch of it, the cluster of black hollows buildings visible from the ridge, smoke from chimneys, the distant geometry of fenced pastures. It looked smaller than she remembered. "Ready?" Thorne said. "I've been ready," she said. Black Hollow noticed them when they rode in. She felt it, the attention that moved through a small town like a current, that particular quality of awareness a community has when something it thought was settled turns out not to be. She'd left in October with nothing. She was riding back in on a good horse with a document case behind her saddle and Thorne Calloway beside her, and people on the main street looked at this combination and revised something in their assessment. Franklin Cole came out of the supply store when he saw them. He looked at the document case and then at Evelyn's face, and then he nodded once, the nod of a man who'd done his part, and was satisfied to see the rest taking shape. "Lawyer's expecting you," he said. "He's been building since your package arrived. Says he has what he needs for the hearing." "Good," she said. "Thank you, Franklin." "How's the mountain?" he said in the tone of a man asking about something more than a mountain. "Standing," she said. The lawyer's name was Horace Dean, a compact, precise man of 50 who operated out of an office above the haberdashery in Crestfall, and who had, in the 40 days since receiving Evelyn's documents, assembled a case that he laid out for them over 3 hours at his office table. She listened to him describe the pattern of Vane's fraud, the falsified surveys, the manipulated county records, the 3-year gap between Eli Calloway's death and any official review of the circumstances, and heard in it the shape of everything she'd assembled from the document box in the cabin, confirmed and amplified and given legal structure. Thorne was very still during this portion of the meeting. She was aware of him beside her, aware of what it cost him to hear Eli's name in a legal context, the specific quality of Thorne's stillness that was not composure, but the management of something that had been carried in his body for 3 years and was now being carefully set down in a formal, structured place. She didn't look at him during this part. She kept her eyes on Dean and her attention on the legal architecture. He didn't need her watching him. He needed her in the room being the person she was. The formal hearing was scheduled for 6 weeks out at the county seat. Dean filed motions in the interim that immediately froze any further survey authorizations connected to the Calloway Ridge property. Vane's lawyers responded, which Dean had expected, and the response was, according to Dean, the response of a legal team that had just realized their client's documentation didn't hold up to scrutiny. "He built this over years," Dean said, "but he built it fast and with the assumption that it would never face serious challenge. When you assume you won't be challenged, you get sloppy in specific ways." He tapped the document case. "This is what sloppy looks like when someone patient finally looks at it." She thought about 3 months on a mountain, learning to read the difference between yesterday's tracks and this morning's. Learning to see the pattern under the surface. "He didn't expect us to have this," she said. "He didn't expect to be challenged at all," Dean said. "Men like Vane are accustomed to the kind of opposition that gives up eventually. They're not accustomed to someone who builds a case while defending the land at the same time." Thorne looked at Evelyn. She looked at Dean. "What are his options now?" Thorne asked. "He can fight the hearing, which will expose more of his record rather than less. He can settle, which means acknowledging the fraud and losing the claim. Or he can disappear the problem, which he already tried once and which is considerably harder when there's an active legal file and a lawyer of record involved." Dean folded his hands on the table. "I'd expect him to attempt a quiet settlement first, something that looks like he's being reasonable rather than cornered." "We don't settle for less than full relinquishment of the claim and a formal record of the fraud," Evelyn said. Dean looked at her. "That's a harder position to hold." "I know," she said. "We hold it anyway." Thorne said nothing. He didn't need to. The 6 weeks before the hearing were strange, a kind of suspension between one phase of the story and the next. They stayed in Black Hollow, which was its own adjustment after 6 months on the mountain. The town had questions about them that it was asking in the sideways, lateral way of small communities that don't ask directly but make their curiosity visible in other ways. People came into Franklin's store when she was there. Thomas Ackerley nodded at her on the street with an expression that was different from anything he'd shown her in October set. The nod of a man acknowledging that he'd miscalculated something. Margaret Hollis had nothing to say, which was notable given her previous volume. Her father was better than she'd left him. Not well, not transformed, but better. He'd held to the arrangement with Franklin about the credit. He'd let the Hendersons look in on him. He was thin and older-looking and very quiet when she sat with him the first evening back, but the quiet was different from the dulled, checked-out quiet of a man deep in the bottle. It was the quiet of a man who'd been doing the work of getting himself back and was too tired from it to talk much, but was still doing the work. "I heard things," he said, "about the mountain, about what you did up there." "Word travels," she said. "Word about you travels," he said. He looked at his hands on the table. I wasn't what I should have been while you were gone, before you left, for years before that." "I know," she said. "I'm trying," he said. "I know that too." She put her hand over his on the table, briefly, the same gesture as the morning she'd left, reversed. He pressed her hand, and then she took it back, and they sat in the kitchen that smelled of wood smoke without the whiskey underneath it anymore. And outside Black Hollow went about its business, and neither of them needed to say anything else about what the past 4 years had cost because they both already knew. And what mattered now was what came next. The hearing was held on a Thursday in late April at the county seat. The room was smaller than she'd expected and smelled of paper and old wood. And the judge was a woman of 60 with the specific tired patience of someone who'd been making difficult decisions in small rooms for a long time. August Vane was there with 2 lawyers. He was a compact, well-dressed man of 60 who looked exactly like what he was. Someone accustomed to being the most powerful person in any given situation, who had not yet fully accepted that this particular situation had changed. He looked at Evelyn when she came in, and she could see him categorizing her, and finding the category insufficient to explain what was happening to him. She sat down across the room and opened the document case. The hearing took 4 hours. Dean presented the evidence, the falsified surveys, the altered records, the pattern of claim disputes, the suspicious circumstances of Eli Calloway's death 3 years ago. Vane's lawyers objected 14 times. The judge overruled 11 of the 14. Vane's lead lawyer presented their counterargument, which was professionally constructed and rested almost entirely on the validity of the county recorder's authorization process. Dean pulled out 3 specific examples of that process being compromised, sourced from documents Evelyn had organized in the cabin by firelight in December, and the counterargument developed a structural problem it couldn't recover from. Midway through the afternoon, Vane leaned over and said something to his lead lawyer. The lawyer's expression shifted by a degree that was subtle and visible at the same time. They asked for a recess. Dean came over to Thorne and Evelyn during the recess and said quietly, "He's going to offer a settlement. Don't take the first number." "We discussed the terms," Evelyn said. "I know. I'm saying the first number won't be the real number. Hold." They held. Vane's lawyers came with an offer that relinquished the claim, but didn't acknowledge fraud. She shook her head and Dean communicated the rejection. 10 minutes later, a second offer. Full relinquishment, a formal acknowledgement of the fraudulent survey filings, and a commitment to cooperate with the county recorder's investigation. The judge reconvened the hearing and formalized the settlement. She read the terms into the record in her tired, patient voice, and when she said fraudulent survey filings, the room was very quiet in a specific way. Thorne was looking at the table in front of him. Evelyn put her hand on his arm, briefly. He didn't look up, but she felt the slight shift in his posture, something releasing, not all at once, but the beginning of it. After the hearing, in the street outside in the pale April sunshine, Vane passed them on his way to his carriage. He stopped, looked at Thorne, looked at Evelyn. He was a man who'd built something over years using other people's losses and was standing now in the first moment of understanding that the architecture had failed. He didn't say anything. Neither did they. There was nothing to say. His carriage left. They stood in the street. "It reopens Eli's case," Thorne said. His voice was quiet. "Yes," Dean said, coming out behind them. The cooperation commitment includes access to records from 3 years ago. What your brother found in the county offices is documentable now through the filing history. It won't be fast, but it won't be closed anymore. Thorne looked at the road where the carriage had gone. She watched his face, the long, weathered face of a man who'd been carrying something in a cold place for a very long time. It didn't transform. It didn't become something else dramatically. But something in the set of it changed, the way a structure changes when load is redistributed. The same materials, differently arranged, carrying more easily. Good, he said. They rode back to Black Hollow. They stayed another week, finishing business. Dean needed signatures. There were documents to file. There was the question of the silver extraction process going forward legally now that the land's status was clear. Local businesses expressed interest in the territory's water rights and commercial potential. She handled these conversations with the same methodical attention she'd applied to everything else. And by the end of the week, she'd sketched out a development approach that protected the land's integrity while generating enough revenue to fund the legal follow-up on Eli's case, and then some. Her father came to see them off when they rode out. He looked at Thorne for a moment, really looked at him, the way Gerald Mercer looked at people when he was sober and paying attention, which was a particular quality of attention she remembered from her childhood. Then he looked at Evelyn. "The ridge," he said. "Your mother would have liked that." She smiled, a real one, unguarded. "I think she would have." "Come down before winter," he said. "We will," she said. They rode north. The valley fell away behind them and the mountain rose ahead, the north ridge dark and familiar above the tree line, the east face catching morning light across the rock. She knew every section of that trail now in her body. She knew the holds on the east granite face, and the travel paths in the lower timber, and the seeps that didn't freeze, and the specific sound of a northeast wind coming off the ridge before a front moved in. Thorne rode beside her without speaking, which was how they often rode now, and not the silence of people with nothing to say, but the silence of people who'd found a rhythm that didn't need to be narrated. At the base of the upper trail, where the terrain started asking something of you, he said, "The East Face documentation. I was thinking about hiring 2 men for the extraction work this summer. Local men who know mountains." "2 is right," she said. "Not more. The operation needs to stay manageable." "You'd want to be in on the hiring." "I want to be in on the hiring," she agreed. He nodded. They kept riding. She thought about what Dean had said, someone who builds a case while defending the land at the same time, and understood that this was what she'd been doing, in one form or another, for longer than 6 months. Building a case for herself while defending the ground she stood on. Not dramatically, not in a single heroic moment. In the cold morning by cold morning, mistake by mistake, correction after correction way that things actually get built when they get built to last. You don't earn a life by waiting for someone to offer it to you. She'd learned that at 20, watching her father's life come undone, understanding that the version of herself that waited for rescue was going to wait a long time. She'd learned it again at 24 in a decorated barn, standing near the back wall while the room arranged itself around her absence. She'd learned it in November on a mountain that didn't care about her name and kept teaching her things anyway. The mountain came back into full view above the tree line as they crested the last ridge before the cabin. It looked exactly as it always had. Indifferent, vast, entirely itself, presenting the same conditions to her as to everything else on it. She thought about all the versions of herself that had stood in all the rooms of her life, feeling small and found wanting, and having nothing but her own 2 hands and whatever was in her head. She thought about what those hands had built since October. She thought about the document case, now filed in a court record somewhere. She thought about Eli, who died carrying evidence that had finally made it to where it was supposed to go, 3 years late. She thought, it counts. All of it counts. Even the 7 men walking away. Even her father's bottles lined up behind the wood stove. Even the mended hem and the 2 large gloves and the pine needle tea that wasn't coffee. It all counted because it had all made her into someone who could do what needed to be done when it needed doing, without waiting for a better set of circumstances or a different version of herself. That was the thing nobody tells you about becoming who you're supposed to be. There's no moment when it happens. There's just the work, and then more work. And then one day you look back at the distance between where you started and where you are, and the distance is the answer. The cabin was visible now in the granite lee, its low roof and solid walls exactly where they'd left them, the mountain rising behind it with complete and permanent indifference. She rode toward it. She was home,